Everyone ready? Imagine waking up every morning with a jaded cynicism that everything in your life, everything you accomplish, everything you work for means nothing. That the things that are most important to a human life are things out of your reach or things you have failed to achieve, and that your life is utterly worthless, with contempt for the things that have gotten you where you are and the things you might accomplish in the future. We say that this is incompatible with the human good to such a large extent that we think it is unacceptable for anyone to reach a space of such despondency that they do not even value their own life. So, a brief bit of modeling what we're talking about. We think what we are talking about is things like suicide, deep depression, things where you're convinced your life has no purpose, has no meaning. We think that can obviously blend into a lot of different people. We're not just saying a small percentage of people. We think maybe like 5% of the population would feel this. We think everyone in the population should take the pill so they have no risk of ending up in that 5% of depressed people. We think, though, that in the status quo, plenty of contented people still pursue jobs where they work for ends, they want to make money to feed their family, they want to have social movements that pursue social justice and other accomplishments they have for. We do not envision this as a radical, we'll have arguments for how this changes all these things, but we do envision humans not saying, oh, I could die the next 5 minutes because I don't have any food and I'm perfectly fine with that. Humans still have pragmatic reasons to pursue ends, they're just never convinced that their lives are worthless or had no purpose. Is this a clarification? Okay. Our first argument is that how being convinced your life is worthless is the worst thing for a human life. We think that generally the human creature does two things. We experience the world and we act in accordance to make our wills efficacious in the world. We think that being convinced of your worthlessness is terrible for both aspects of the human creature. So, what are we talking about? People who are convinced that maybe suicide is the only option for them, or people that they have no real potential in life to effecate themselves, we think is incredibly painful, but also competes with your purpose-driven life to do and accomplish certain actions. We think first, this means people who have depression report lower utility. They don't enjoy their life. It's very hard for them to value relationships with others. It's very hard for people to feel like they should have a meaningful relationship with their friends and family if they don't even feel that those are things that could give their life meaning, or that their life has enough meaning that they would want to interact with other people and give meaning to their lives through those interactions. But also it's just incredibly painful because humans have a feeling that their lives should matter, that they need some purpose to what's going on. A feeling of meaningless means that people are often incredibly unhappy, and that's why they're driven often to terrible things like self-harm or things that are trying to act out an emotional reaction that they can't react to the world around them. But we also think that humans are not just experiencers, and we think experiences in depression or states of suicidal malaise are terrible experiences. We're also doers. We also act on the world and try to have purposes that we enact over time. Why do we think a type of worthlessness or contempt for your own life is incapable with that aspect of humans as agents? We think that for your actions to matter, you have to be convinced that you're making a difference in the world. That when you coach your son's Little League team, you're making it a better place. That when you interact with people in your workplace, when you open the door for someone, you're helping them. Even though you'll never change the world, people need to be convinced that their actions have some sort of meaning, that they're doing things that are good for other people. We think someone who is convinced of the worthlessness of their life cannot have that view of action where their purposes have meaning. If they were convinced that, by doing those small acts of kindness, by helping people out, by being a provider for their family, by making the PTA function, by doing socially important work, by being part of a social movement, if they were convinced those things mattered, they would think their lives mattered because they were helping to accomplish those goals. That means that to view your own life as meaningless, to view yourself as something beneath contempt that cannot actually have a purpose or satisfaction in your life, and that you have failed as being a human, means you've failed at doing all these other actions. It means you don't value the things you're trying to accomplish in life, or the things you could do to make humanity better for others. At that place, it means you get into a place of despondency where you can't actually efficaciously help other people. You're not convinced that making social change or doing things for others matters. We think this makes it incredibly hard to fulfill your moral duties to other people, your moral and ethical and pragmatic duties to help your friends, your family, and humanity as a whole. But it also means that in terms of what you view yourself as doing in the world, when you act, when you try to make a difference, all of those things become worthless because you're not convinced you can actually efficaciously do anything. You're convinced that you're worthless precisely because you don't believe your actions have significance. I'll take a look.
If a depressed person takes a pill, the objective circumstances of their existence notably still remain bad. If they are now contented, they're less likely to seek help and less likely to be offered to it. This means that they stay in worse circumstances.
Why a depressed person's life is bad is the problem we are solving, right? Look at what they said. They said, in our world, people won't have the same incentive to change their circumstances. But if they don't have the same incentive, it's because their circumstances aren't bothering them to the same extent. The extent to which that argument is true is a reason for our side that people have come to grips with what's going on and value themselves as actors and as experiencers. Why do we think this is a proper thing for you to take a pill to solve? One, because you don't control your self-worth anyway. Neurochemistry and biology cause most of depression. We often know in the modern world that these things aren't things in your control. Suicide and contempt are not moral failings or arguments or rational deliberations that you come to. These are things having to do with your serotonin receptors being bad, and things also like social status in the society you live in, telling you that if you're not attractive, if you don't make a lot of money, if you're not smart, your life isn't as worthwhile as other people's. That means that on their side of the house, taking this pill isn't tricking some rational deliberation you had. You're being convinced of your worthlessness is often a product of your neurochemistry and the society around you having status structures that are inimical to many people's interests. This is not a trick. This means that many people who have no choice over this can actually get to a good place on our side of the house. Our second argument concerns social change, and we think there are other things you can worry about in life than just being despondent, right? You still care about some sort of inequality, you still care about social injustice. Why do we think we get better social change on our side of the house? First, you have more effective movements on our side. We think there are plenty of people who have been incredibly effective for social change who haven't had a bleak view of the future. People like Nelson Mandela or Gandhi, who saw the value in human life, were able to still say, and were completely contented with what their life, were able to say they had the hope that they could accomplish their goals, and also had the idea that you should solve little problems, even without the implication that without it human life would be meaningless. We think on their side of the house, you get the despondency which leads to suicide bombings and extremism. Things like the Second Intifada, which make it much less likely to have a Palestinian state versus peaceful protest. Second, middle-class satisfaction. In a world where middle-class people don't often constantly have to keep up with the Joneses, buying clothes, buying things that make them feel like their lives are valuable, they can look out to the world and see things that actually matter, things like inequality, things like social injustice. We are very, very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister and now call upon the Leader of the Opposition.
What taking this pill is in effect doing is tantamount to giving your future self Stockholm Syndrome, to be forever enslaved to the soft tyranny of low expectations under the guise of contentment. What is our stance? Firstly, we will not take the pill. Secondly, this doesn't mean that we would be dissatisfied with all aspects of our lives, but means that in the vast majority of cases, what will happen to people is that they will retain the moral disposition to be critical about parts of their existence and feel like maybe parts of my life may not contribute towards much, but on the whole I can still make a difference in the world in some meaningful way, and there are parts of myself and parts of other people's lives that I can meaningfully improve. I'm going to forward three arguments. Firstly, that this is immoral to the future self. Secondly, this helps other people to whom you have a meaningful obligation. And last of all, that this helps yourself. But before that, let's deal with the bulk of opening government's case that has to do with feelings of worthlessness leading to things like suicide and depression. First of all, I think that the vast majority of people, like 95%, believe their lives have some meaning and aren't driven to such extents of suicide and depression. We agree that these are huge problems that plague a large number of people across the world, but it's not clear why the needs of these people trump the needs of other individuals to have meaningful aspirations or desire to have their future lives made better, right? They just haven't proven that to us, even though we think it's a big problem. But fine, let's engage them on their grounds as well. We think that most people who are depressed have their situations alleviated and best addressed by other people who are counselors, who are family members who go the extra way to help them. We think the interventions of these people are motivated by a super moral belief that I can change the world, that as a counselor, as a volunteer, I can change and affect other people's lives in a meaningful way. We think this is how we actually best deal with the problem of depression, anxiety, suicide, and things like that, by having people who are willing to step out of their own comfort sphere to believe that there is something I can improve about myself and improve about the rest of the world. So we think that on the comparative, we marginally might help these people in these circumstances. Our last response, and perhaps this might hint at the rest of the case, is that perhaps there are other moral values at stake besides contentment, and it should not be the be be-all and end-all of human life. It is not the goal of existence to just be content, which is what they assume is true. Let's use an analogy here. People locked in abusive relationships experience learned helplessness and Stockholm Syndrome, and they believe that they are comfortable with these relationships and with these circumstances. Yet we would not prefer to live in a world where every single abused person experiences learned helplessness or Stockholm Syndrome, for the reason that we think there is active moral value in trying to change these circumstances and trying to resist oppression, and we think that abuse is a moral harm that should be contested. So we think that their side has to deal with a world where people who live in such oppressive and harmful circumstances that drive them to suicide and depression should then be content to live in these circumstances and not change anything about them. So we think that there's an important analogy here, and it's not clear why contentment is the sole moral value of human life, or why utility is the sole moral value of human life. First point of argument, that this is immoral. We think that individuals have distinct present and future personalities. You 10 years from now is a completely different being with substantially different set of memories, aspirations, as beliefs, and you now. And we think that selfhood is comprised of the sum total of these aspirations, memories, and beliefs. Like of someone at 60 years old, it's obviously not the same person as they were at 20 years old. To some extent, it is a regrettable fact of existence that actions of the past often have huge bearing on your future self. But we try as much as possible to avoid choices that totally constrain the freedoms of the future self to an irreversible degree. For example, you can't sell yourself into slavery. For example, things like hard drugs are either highly controlled in terms of the distribution or illegal due to their addictive properties in terms of constraining the freedoms of the future self. We think that what this proposal guarantees is that the future self of the person taking this pill in a moment will never be able to exercise or have meaningful aspiration and is forced to accept their circumstances in a way that is analogous to giving them Stockholm Syndrome. Yes?
So a lot of medical drugs, for example anti-anxiety drugs, permanently change your brain even while being treated temporarily. Would you ban anti-anxiety drugs if they change your future self?
First of all, we don't think that the extent is the same as, for example, selling yourself into slavery. We think that there are marginal effects, for example, for consuming food. But we think that if these choices are constrained to such a meaningful degree, then yes, we would ban these drugs. Or in many cases, we think that the benefit that these drugs do might outweigh the harm of keeping these people alive. But we think this debate also deals with the vast majority of people, not just individuals who are suffering from depression. And it's not clear why, for the vast majority of people, being locked in a state of contentment makes their lives qualitatively better. They need to deal with this on Gulf Bench. So we think that what this effectively does is that this makes you a different person and makes you okay with that. And we don't think this is something that you should be allowed to subject your future self to the same way, for example, you can sell yourself into slavery. But the second argument, that this hurts third parties. We think that there are separate moral values that are worth caring about beyond the individual sense of happiness and enlightenment. We think that contentment harms third parties in a number of important ways. First of all, it reduces the push for things like penance or criminal rehabilitation. We think that most people have some meaningful moral failings, and believing that on the whole I can live with these failings, or there is not much that is wrong with my life now except for this small problem that caused me to be fined or go to jail, means people don't choose to improve on their immoral behavior. Yes?
So what is the harm of being in bad circumstances if you're content with them anyway, so you don't perceive the suffering?
Because, as I pointed out, like if you're abused, there's meaningful moral harm that is perpetrated against you, and there's an alternate world in which your life could have been on the whole better if you had visited and identified the problems with your life as it stands. So we don't think that contentment, as I pointed out, is the sole moral value worth caring about in human life. Things like ending oppression are also important, unless you're willing to assert that we're happy to live in a world where, for example, all of like the Uyghurs in China are contented with their lives and have no reason to resist oppression. So we put to you that this drastically reduces the push for criminal rehabilitation and penance. But secondly, it also reduces the incentive to work harder because others around you, like your kids and your dependents. We think that you also have an obligation to them to work harder in terms of trying to earn more money than you currently do and things like that, because you owe special moral obligations, especially to people who are your dependents and your children. Third, we think it also means that we have a greater long-term incentive marginally to care about long-term problems that right now seem like abstractions. For example, things like environmental sustainability and climate change. The very reason why we don't care about these problems is because we think that they are not as important, that the world is fine as it is and I'm already doing my part. We want people to have a super moral obligation to feel like my actions need to contribute to more than that. So we think that this actually solves these problems as well. Fourth, we think that this also drives innovation and change in an unfortunately capitalistic society. Right? The direct desire to earn money because you're not happy with your life as it is drives people towards working harder, making new products, and thinking of new ideas. Moreover, this secondly and more subtly creates a spirit of innovation that rewards rejecting the world as it is and also trying to envision the world what it can be. As a consequence, we think that much of the innovation that comes about through capitalism is a direct result of people being dissatisfied both with their financial position as well as with the world around them. So we think that this is a result we can claim from our side, because if people are content, they're less likely likely to do this. And this also deals with the problem about social movements, because we think that many of them start with individuals trying to rectify faults within themselves and then becoming role models for other people. Third, that this helps yourself. Often, we think that to change the situation you find yourself in, you need to actively scrutinize and identify what is directly constraining your life. To do this, you often have to be dissatisfied with the circumstances as they are, either because of what you are not doing or because of what other people are doing to you. Like, for example, choosing to change the fact that you are underemployed, for example, by going for education. Or, for example, choosing to resist and break out of unfair and abusive relationships. We think that these are things that people on the comparative are far more likely to do if they don't accept that it is their lot in life to be oppressed or it is their lot in life to be abused. So we think that even if this is very marginal, we agree that in many cases people have no choice in these matters. But we think that often choice is created when there's critical mass, when people can join together and scrutinize the causes of oppression, and we only create this on-side opposition.
I'd like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for his speech and now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister here.
The worst populist political mobilizations, the worst acts of grievance against others, the worst forms of terroristic manipulations emerge from dissatisfaction. This decimates the opposition for a few reasons. Because your circumstances don't mean you remain static. Under dissatisfaction, the circumstances of your existence become empirically worse when you take up irrational actions out of desperation. They have to weigh that for them to even come close to prevailing in this debate. But on a second point of clarification, satisfaction is not experiencing visceral emotion. It is stepping back from your life at a point in time and holistically evaluating your existence as having been worthwhile. You suffer under oppression. The difference is you still think your existence was good on net. If anything, that makes you more likely to mobilize because you have something to mobilize for, i.e. the satisfaction of your life, the good that comes from your life. The majority of nihilism that dominates sub-Saharan apathy to their own institutional failings emerges precisely from an institutionalized dissatisfaction, the feeling that nothing can be done from it. They literally lose on the own premise they set out for themselves. Two substantive points. One, why dissatisfaction, nihilism, makes you act against your self-interest out of crippling decimation. That's not only qualitative, but it's quantitative. And that means that we beat them on their best ground because on net, we still make the world better and empirically make life more worthy of that satisfaction as well, which fulfills the metric they give you. Firstly, I'm going to deal with the rebuttal. The first point they tell us is most people view their lives as worth living. We would say, first of all, that the malaise that some people feel of dissatisfaction, even if they still don't want to kill themselves because literally the barriers to suicide are so high, still is something that should be addressed. Like a lot of people don't want to visit harms upon their parents, don't want to visit harms upon their family. That is the metric that stops them from doing really terrible things to them. It doesn't mean we shouldn't value the torture of their existence and try to rectify that torture. That's why it's not only about the 2 to 3%. It's about everyone who considers their life as worthless and considers every day of their life as agony, but doesn't actually do anything about it because of the social barriers to enacting that, because of the literal fear of enacting anything. They have to prove that something meaningful emerges from that dissatisfaction. The only meaningful mechanism they give is anti-oppression. We're going to beat them on that own mobilization material, leaving them with literally no mechanism at the end of this debate. The answer is you don't rail against oppression. The first point is here, again, to rail against oppression effectively, you need to care about the satisfaction of your life and the life of others around you. I.e., dissatisfaction doesn't only affect you as an internal actor, it affects how you conceive of the lives of others. So, for example, when you commit a desperate act, you do it because you don't care about the consequences for yourself or others, therefore hinder the movement more broadly. That's not only about an internal act, but it reframes the entire movement more broadly. But second of all, you should not be subjected to torture in pursuit of rectifying torture, i.e., there is an agony that emerges from dissatisfaction which is probably commensurate to the dissatisfaction of injustice in and of itself. You ought not have to suffer more from railing against injustice when injustice is already an asymmetric harm which is borne upon you. We think we should make the barriers to railing against injustice as low as possible. That's something that can win us this debate in and of itself. Second of all, let's say you cannot sell yourself into slavery. Here's a lurid distinction I might give to you. Slavery is an objective harm that you'd still probably conceive as bad under our side, i.e. you value people's liberty. It's not like you just have a reckless abandon under our side where you're like, if I'm in shackles every day and feel dissatisfied, I'm not going to try to change his individual circumstances. The reason you still care about your individual circumstances is because at the point at which you recognize satisfaction is a good thing, you recognize more satisfaction as a better thing. So we don't change the spectrum here, guys. Think about this. People want more happiness, but only at the point at which they've experienced happiness in the first place, and they care about the happiness of their life in the first place. We give them the intuition to continue to pursue better forms of happiness, not just to be contented, like they're contented, but literally just to sit static in their own situation. That's why, when they talk about their supramoral obligation, they really miss how supramoral obligations actually emerge within society. Why do you care about other people? I would posit, and they give you absolutely no reasoning for this beyond an assertion, I would posit first of all that his supramoral obligation emerges because you feel satisfied from the work that you give to others. I.e., you see other actors in society, you see that your existence provides a tangible benefit to them, and you feel satisfaction from that, which means you're more likely to act in that way in future. Before I go on, closing.
Notably, at the moment when you are a depressed person and you are suicidal, any trade-off seems better than what you currently have. Therefore, offering them a decision that is necessarily going to be irrational and irreversible in and of itself is immoral at this point.
It's not immoral for a few reasons. One, we would say that depression literally reduces to the nihilism. That means you don't actually try to change your circumstances. So you actually literally are garnering their very sentiment and their very irrationality at that point in time. We make them more irrational because we just say that depression in the majority of circumstances is neurochemistry. It's not your fault in the majority of circumstances you feel the way you do. So why should you submit them to that arbitrary harm? If they want to test us on arbitrariness, they should probably look at their own case first. We change that arbitrary metric by making it about the satisfaction they can pursue in their life and making them reframe their obligations in that way. So where does a supramoral obligation emerge from? A value of the work you would do. The mechanism for morality is quite literally caring about your own life. Because if you don't care about your existence, I'm really hard-pressed to find a reason why you'd care about the existence of others beyond the harm that is visited upon them, but that is much less compelling when it doesn't actually improve substantially your own life. I.e., I'm much more willing to help the global poor at the point at which I feel satisfied with my own existence because I'm not trying to relativistically bump up my own standards at every single turn. And it's the second mechanism that literally receives no response. We tell you that people who relativistically evaluate their own plight no longer do so in the same way. I.e., your Chardonnay drinking person from a rich suburb in the middle of nowhere doesn't go, oh damn it, I don't have the Porsche. They go, objectively, what are the harms that exist in society? I want to make my life even more satisfactory. That means pursuing a utilitarian good, because it's no longer about a comparative good. It's no longer about the relativism of whether or not I can increase my own contentedness because you're already at a point of satisfaction. It's about what can I do for others. The reason you value those other actors is because you value your own satisfaction. You see how much that satisfaction has benefited you because you've experienced it in the first place, and therefore you're likely to want to give that to other people in the same way that has benefited you. So, literally, at this point, what happens in this speech? The mechanism for all of their action, for social mobilization, requires you to care about the satisfaction that is embedded within your life in the first place. In the absence of that, they have no mechanism, they can't come back from that. So we tell you, one, you ought not have to subject people to torture, and two, that torture is actively counterproductive. So proud to vote.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister. Now call upon the DLO to close out the top half of the debate. Great year.
social change does not come from middle-class individuals who already are lacking in empathy with people who actually need it, who are distanced materially from the actual people who are on the ground. It actually rather comes from protests of millions of people who actually want to change stuff within their own circumstances, rather than locking them all into a sort of form of twisted Stockholm syndrome. They concede this themselves when they talk about the examples of people like Gandhi, of people who actually had to lead protests. So while people like that may by themselves have had satisfied lives, they would not have had the vast majority of support that they had coming out from people actually having massive discontent on the ground and actually being able to change things. First, on the principle about contentment and whether you can actually change yourself in this way. Second, on the practical claims in this debate. On the principle. So, notice that there's a principal fallacy in this, because post facto, you will always say that it's worth it because contentment is the only thing that you care about. But before that, we claim that there are other things that you might care about that mean that you do not want to be content all the time. So, for instance, in the Arthur's unrebutted example of someone who is like a prisoner and who would have like a better quality of life under the side of the house if they were always contented, that may not be the thing that they want to do because they care about other things. They have other moral values that they also care about, that they want to stop this. First, the principal thing they have to contend with is whether it's a moral decision to change your future self in such a way. The PM says that it's neurochemistry, so it's fine. But like, ultimately, everyone's self is neurochemistry. But this is it's not a philosophically distinct distinction there. Notice, I think there is no difference between this and selling yourself into slavery. The response we get of an objective harm is not true, because slavery is only a harm in as much as you experience it in this way. I think given that opening government conceded that selling yourself into slavery is a wrong thing, therefore that government bench has conceded that there is a principal problem with actually having bad moral positions now. But I also think that people do not generally want themselves to be in such a bad condition. Secondly, even if you can decide radically for your future self, like tens of years in the future, whether it's fine, notice that there are other moral values that mean that you may not be allowed to do this. But thirdly, notice that we are trying to claim that there are third-party harms, again, which means that you're not allowed to, in terms of social change, but also because if lots of people start taking this, there's a massive pressure for future people to take this in a way that erases the identity and idea of self. I'll take closing.
Do you fear death?
I don't know. Well, like, it's quite far away right now. I'll see how, well, hopefully, I'll see how it impacts in the future. On the practical claims in this debate, the Prime Minister talks about depressed people. Notice, by way of mitigation, I think this is a very small proportion of this debate, because there are a relatively small number of depressed people, because there are current ways to help, in terms of practical alleviation of these circumstances, something that gets easier in the side of the house, and because of the existence of counsellors and family. Notice the people who are depressed, who do not want to take this radical action to themselves, which we think that a large proportion of this people do not want to, because there is, like we're having this debate, and I personally would not want to, for instance. We think that these people have much less of an option, because instead of like having access to counsellors or having access to people who would help, people just say, oh, take this pill and you're fine. Depression does not matter in this material way otherwise. Notice also that a Deputy Prime Minister impacts again why depression is very bad. We do not doubt that depression is very bad for these people, but not everyone considers their life as worthless and in agony. And also, I do not think that depressed people do not have an idea of satisfaction. I think depressed people know that what they do not want and therefore can try and solve these issues. I'll take opening.
Would you torture oppressed peoples to make them more effective protesters?
No, but I would not. I, as an oppressed person, would not want to have my torture ameliorated in order to make. I think this is an agent-specific thing. That is, I do not think it is moral for me to decide to do this. But I think that if depressed people decide to alleviate their own harm in a radical way, then by this mechanism, I think that is principally not right. On social change, notice that when they talk about dependency versus very extreme things, I think that the comparative here is a question of people in general. So we think that social change comes out from people in the middle and people who actually feel guilt at having done bad things. So for instance, people in the middle need to do things like have an idea of moral striving given possibly bad circumstances. That only happens under our side of the house at a point when they are radically dissatisfied with the idea of the world. And secondly, people who are doing very extreme or terrible things, who could feel guilt. I think there's a large percentage of the population, this is a very large percentage of the population of people who do these terrible things, who could go through rehabilitation or could do things. If you are, as a criminal who's committed a violent crime, try and make your life worthwhile post facto and realizing that, then it means that it's very hard for you to come to terms with the fact that this violent crime could actually have been a bad could have been a bad thing, given that you have to try and rationalize your life as being net good despite that. Finally, Deputy Prime Minister says you need to care about satisfaction of your life and the life of others. Maybe this is true of depression, but this is not true of all people. And I think that social change comes from the vast majority of people. But also, I think that depressed people still have an idea of what satisfaction is in their life. Finally, on the idea of people who are in the middle class who do not need to keep up, and therefore they change stuff. It is not a priori true to me why being content with class security does insecurity is more important than social problems in terms of middle class people's contentness. I think the second is probably more likely to be true because people in the middle class empirically go to as a method of the discontent trying to buy a Porsche, for instance, than trying to save social problems. So if you remove some of their discontentment, it's not clear to me why they would remove the discontentment of trying to solve social problems rather than remove the discontentment of trying to buy a Porsche rather than remove the discontentment of trying to solve social problems. But secondly, then there is a next question, which is why people themselves, who will actually create this social change on the ground. I do not think middle class people are in the best position to do it, but I think people themselves are more likely to do this or not. Finally, notice that there's an important impact to this in the sense of people not having the impetus to change on behalf of other people. So I think if you're part of the middle class right now and you see all the impoverished people in the world and you think they're actually doing fine because they have a net content life having had this pill, then they're less likely to try and change the situations in the world because you do not think this is a net bad thing. You can either go to analogy to your own life and say this is not a net bad thing because my own life is content and their life will be content anyway. This means there's a much less of an impetus for social change at the point when everyone just says, oh, but your life is content so we don't need to change anything material about the world. Absent a radical thing that the circumstances of the world do not matter because everyone in the world has taken this pill, which we think is extremely unlikely at the point when people are unlikely to all take the pill, and I think some people have moral values apart from that, then I think that you actually have to care about actually helping the people who need it most. The people who need it most will be most helped when there's an idea that they actually need material circumstances changing, rather than you can just give them a pill and that means that no moral problems actually matter to them. I'm proud to have those.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, and now call upon the Member of Government to open up the back half. Here, here.
Thanks.
Consider the narrowness of opening half. Firstly, when people are not contented, that does not occur in a vacuum or a solitary cell. People take advantage of you, the malcontent. Secondly, not everyone is depressed, but we are all human. The state and condition of being a human being is that we will all eventually die, and that is an infinite fear which accrues to everybody and completely broadens the scope of this debate. So with that said, the first point of extension that we want to bring is why the modern world is set up structured in a way which is so pernicious for individuals and how that interacts with those who are not contented. Note that anxiety and stress is something which is incredibly prevalent under the status quo. There are two forces for that. The first is briefly touched on by opening government. That is to say, internally or intrinsically, you may be predisposed to being, for example, anxious. But they ignore the external or extrinsic force, which is much more determinative. And that is to say, the world that exists and has been created and shaped around us, and the way in which that interacts with us as human beings. So, two important contexts which we have. Firstly, capitalist economies are the predominant force, and those are predominantly run by neoliberal market ideologies. But secondly, we live in a world with pervasive technology, and that's a world in which we are probably more technically connected than ever, but never have felt more alone. And that's important, because in the status quo currently, everything you feel is relational. That is to say, you have to feel that you are better than other people, as opposed to being intrinsically satisfied. So, two things happen under the status quo which we change. Firstly, you overvalue material wealth. That is to say, you probably buy more food, or you buy more jewellery, or whatever it is that you think is a show of material wealth or success that you do not actually need, but it is performative in the way in which you play off relationally against other people. But secondly, you are less likely to value things like family time or non-material goods, because the way in which society is structured is a way in which does not place a value on that in terms of getting to the position of being contented, but on the outside, obviously you change that. So opening government very, very briefly touches on the self self-serving mechanisms here, that is to say, without the context that we provide, and opening opposition relies on the assertion that you can only understand a moral obligation if you are depressed. But the mechanism that we add is that under the status quo, you think you can climb the ladder, and that climbing is often a zero-sum activity, which encourages antisocial behaviours and rewards those behaviours in a way in which crowds out other people. Because you see the oasis of contentment. You want to be the best, and know what? Not everybody can be the best. Only one or a limited amount of people then. So the unique contribution that this extension provides and why it's so important is that people take advantage of you in the way in which you have perceptions of what you need to do to become contented. And then you combine that with all of the individual mechanisms that exist. The short-serving or self-serving biases that you may have. The expectations that you have, where the lows feel worse than the highs, or they feel more impactful than the highs. Those things feed into each other. So for example, it might play off to the extent that you feel about, you have issues about being overweight. So for example, under the status quo, you might have body image issues in a particular way because of the way in which corporations can market to your fears and your worst expectations about the way you look. And that knocks out all the benefits that OO tried to assert that they gained. Because the key incentive in the status quo is for society itself to structure itself in such a way that rewards the pursuit of satisfaction at the exclusion of others. So the delta that we provide in our case is that companies no longer have an incentive to take advantage of you because they can't extract capital from you in the same way. Whether that's your labour or whether that's your consumerism or your expenditure. The pushes from OO here are tiny. Firstly, on innovation, that is a complete misconception about what it means to be malcontent or miscontented, and that you, for some reason, you need the basis of being content to be satisfied. So, for example, the push here is that angry people have changed the world, but haven't, given any credence to the fact that a lot of people who are fairly content in their circumstances have also changed the world. It's almost like they want to get to the same end point as us, just with a lot more trauma on the way, which is obviously absolutely ludicrous and loses them this debate. Their final point there was on criminal rehabilitation. If you really want to compare that to the status quo, we have a lot more bitter and unhappy people in the way in which their prejudices and biases are unlocked and weaponized. Be my guest. Before I move on to our second extension, I'll take a POI if anyone's got one. Yep.
Okay, so the comparative is contentedness versus true satisfaction. So if you're a person who has body image issues, we say it's better that you have outrage, which then leads to the plus size model movement, which makes you feel truly accepted in your body, rather than just content with discrimination.
Okay, so I have a debating theory. This is called a Batman argument, and the Batman argument is essentially that we are happy that crime exists in Gotham because we have Batman. But our case is that we'd rather the crime didn't exist at all. You don't have the problem which you're trying to fix, and that's why opening bench loses this debate. Our second problem of extension is on existentialism and death, and this engages with opening opposition's pushes on morality and about what it means to care about other people as well. So, note that we tell you that the state of being human is something which is first of all faced by everybody, and second of all is an infinite harm, because you can never fix or solve death in the way OO tried to caveat and assert that they solve all the other problems of society. The impact there is huge because the decisions that you make are necessarily more prejudicial and biased to the self, because the extension of the self is something you do not know the end outcome from. They say decisions constraining the future self are problematic. Unclear again, why is it a constraint if it improves your happiness on net? Then they say, but people have Stockholm Syndrome. Practically, what's the comparative? Opening opposition cannot model in that anybody with Stockholm Syndrome gets that situation fixed. They have to deal with all of the barriers to entry for that exist. That is not a world in which you can pick the perfect world and say it occurs on your side. So, first thing is the changes about this extension is you do not need to be suicidal to have a fear of death, and that's why we extend on opening governance material. But secondly, you provide in here infinite benefit to the extent that humans no longer fear death and you can make more rational decisions. Before I move on to my final analysis, I'll take a POI for my meeting.
Fine. So to be clear, both you and opening government believe that satisfaction and utility is the be-all and all, and no other moral values should matter.
Okay, let's talk about morality now. The issue with opening government here is that they say, and it will implicitly reply to opening opposition, is opening government's mechanism on your relationship with others is that you learn that actions have meaning, as if you are a Pavlovian dog. That is the wrong mechanism. The mechanism that is actually true is one of prioritization. That is to say that you currently in the status quo prioritize yourself because of your path to seeking contentment. So, what do we change? Firstly, you make less toxic decisions to others. That is important. For example, if you are the leader of a family, you're less likely to make riskier decisions as you do under the status quo. Because the mechanism here, again, which opening government misses, is that it's not that you're depressed, it's you are stressed. And you remove the stress on our side of the house Because you don't get trapped into considering your own circumstances, you can consider the circumstances of others. And the scale there is much larger. Opening government's material is just the decision that you make as yourself, but we may change it to the decision that you make for everybody around you, and that is much larger. But secondly, now you can look to make others satisfied as well. That is to say, you're more likely to engage in pro-social behaviours like charity or other effective altruism mechanisms. Again, the key mechanism there is that you still see the circumstances of others as pernicious, for example, slave labour in developing countries, but the difference is that you are now able to prioritise the needs of other people. It is not that you have learned to be a good moral actor, that is not the point, it is that you can prioritise other people.
I'd like to thank the member of government for his speech, and now call upon the member of the opposition. Hear, hear.
Malo razlike od prve opozicije. Znači, oni su to malo pričali, ali znaš, da, mislim kao, burni da bude naši.
Okay, so CEO is going to be the only team in this debate to show you actual societal change. But before we do that, let's just deal with what CG tells you. We think CG is correct when they say there's a lot of extrinsic influences which impact your life. To the extent to which that is true, we think both government sides extremely limit the ability of people to navigate these extrinsic conditions. Why is this true? Because on their side it is far less able, and people are far less able to learn from their mistakes. Because the reason why you decide not to do something in the future is because in the past it made you dissatisfied, and that feeling of dissatisfaction is something you're psychologically conditioned to try to avoid. What does this mean? This means that at everyday level you have plenty of opportunities to learn, literally from everyday communication and everyday mistakes you make, which are all lower on the government side. This means two things. One, you're less capable of accessing objectively good lessons which may land you better outcomes in life, i.e., I fucked up on a job interview, I was ashamed, I'm dissatisfied with the outcome, so I'm going to change the way I communicate, I'm going to improve my CV and be more ambitious. But it also makes it far less likely to avoid third-party harm that they also want to talk about. They talk about prioritizing family over material life. But note, CG, on your side, people are not only less satisfied with family experiences, because on your side also, if you feel an extremely good experience, which would in normal cases pleasure you highly, on your side it only makes you content. So you're less likely to value the things you want to value equally as you're less likely to value material life, but you're also less likely to try to improve your relationships with your family members because you do not feel the moral dissatisfaction of having betrayed them because you are content with the current state of your life, i.e. you are content with the behavior you are perpetuating towards others. So that dissatisfaction on a moral level does not exist, therefore you're less likely to act better towards other people, especially because acting in a charitable way requires to an extent a degree of compassion, meaning that you have to understand dissatisfaction yourself in order to empathize with another one's dissatisfaction, also the mechanism for opening opposition's case. But to this they say, okay, there's another part of our case. Look, this is about people with body image issues and how now it's less easy to perpetuate this kind of discrimination. Note, although they try to dismiss this by banter, the crime still exists. The only thing you're doing is making people satisfied with the crime. On our side, we say, if you have body image problems, it's more likely that people who are outraged are going to try to do something about it. People who are assertive are going to try to help people who are less assertive. Therefore, we have the plus-size model movement, which not only gives people a larger frontier of happiness, because you're exquisitely happy about the way you feel in comparison to actual content, but you also serve the needs of future people who do not have to be exposed to this kind of discrimination. But let's move on to what we want to say in extension. And why do we bring actual societal change? Not opening government is wrong when they say the comparative is terrorism versus peaceful protest. No. The comparative is everyday decisions such as going to vote or not going to vote. One of the primary reasons for political apathy is because you do not want to be bothered and asked to go to the voting ballot because it doesn't matter anyway and I'm pretty much satisfied with the way life is. It's striking or not striking because why would I spend my time and risk my paycheck if my job is perfectly okay? What does this mean? This means that on our side, there's an opportunity every person has, regardless of their mental state, to influence the actors around them, which have power over them, such as states and corporations, which CG wants to talk about. This is actually about an objective frontier of happiness. Because regardless of whether you're content or not, this influences what kind of healthcare you have and whether you're going to die or not. Whether you have insurance on your job and whether you are going to be protected and, for example, get severance payment if you are fired. Whether you will have a job or not. We say that objectively improves conditions for people and improves conditions for the third parties all teams in this debate want to worry about. We say that this is an objective frontier of happiness accessible to people. What does this essentially mean? This essentially means that on their side, they're giving total control to the state. Because the state no longer has to calculate in the fact that people might be dissatisfied. Regardless of the ideological position of the policy, they will always be content. So that degree of outrage is no longer part of the calculus of the people in power. Why is that important? Because the state is hugely more powerful than you. It has the police and the military which it can use to force you to do its bidding. Its laws control every single facet of your life. Given that the world is made up of states and you cannot opt out of being in a state, the only way you can control your destiny and objectively improve it is by controlling the state. This is why essentially what they're doing on their side is removing people's agency. Sure, they may say they had agency to choose it at a given moment, but given the unpredictability and the lack of information about the future, we have a huge problem with this decision being irreversible. Not for most major decisions in life, we give you the capability to reverse them. You make contracts, but you can also sever contracts. You have the right to speak, but you also have the right to remain silent. Because we take into account the fact this hugely influences your life, therefore you should be able to reverse it. But why is this even more pernicious? Because the incentives of people in power also change. It's not just about Nelson Mandela. It's the fact that you no longer have people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders going into politics because they're exquisitely outraged at the world and they're willing to risk their political capital and their political career to influence people. This means essentially get politicians who are contented with their life and are more likely to move towards the political center and not shift the overtone window because that is essentially what is perpetuating their current position. This means the people in power also no longer have an incentive to cater to your needs. This means total control is ceded towards the state. This means frontiers of happiness are something that people are no longer able to experience objectively, regardless of their mental state. That's a problem. I'll take closing.
The problem is your case is premised on an unrealistic characterization. That is to say, depressed people are not the world's most active entrepreneurs. They are apathetic with their circumstances. Therefore, they're unlikely to agitate for change in the way that you rely on.
Perfectly true. We are not talking about depressed people on our side. We are talking about the majority of people. The majority of people who go to the ballot box, the majority of people who go to strike. Complete down comparative. No, thank you, OG. So, moving on to what we want to say on our side as well. Tackling higher forms of social injustice requires a larger trade-off on your side. Notably, if you want to talk about black people rioting against slavery or being a suffragette in the 1900s, it's a huge trade-off. You have to be prepared to risk your life. You have to be prepared to risk 25 lives of imprisonment. OG, and this is my engagement with OG. OG mentions Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was so fucking dissatisfied, he was ready to spend 25 years on Robben Island instead of being in apartheid. Why is that important? For 3 reasons. First of all, because if we do not have a Nelson Mandela, thousands of people still remain under total control of the state exclusively because of their identity. We think it's fair to trade off one person who can and won't initiate change for the thousands of people who cannot and do not want to. Secondly, the frontier of happiness is objectively far higher for you if you have the possibility not to be a slave, not to be in apartheid. The level of contentment you experience as a free person is far greater level of contentment you experience as a slave. But thirdly, and this is the third party harm we mechanize from opening opposition, this is also impacts the lives of future people, the lives of future black people who will not be born into slavery, the lives of future women who will not have or will have the right to vote. At the end of the day, we give agency not just to current people, but to future people as well. We're the only team to break this down on an everyday level. For these reasons, closing opposition wins the debate.
I'd like to thank the member of the opposition for his speech and now call upon the government whip. Here.
Fatal flaw in that speech is even taking them at their very best so they get all the social change you could possibly want. Being rich, being elite, being in a materially good position never actually makes you happy in this current world. Because regardless of how wealthy you are, regardless of whether you can feed your kids or not, you do not feel happy because you fear your own death. Because you are constantly in a society that makes you feel insecure about your body and about your life. That was the problem in this debate. That is why even the elites within a society are often actually more depressed and unhappy than everyone else. Because even if social circumstances changed at their very, very best, contentment was actually the metric we used, and the heuristic was material circumstances. They mix correlation and causation for what we value. We value money because it's meant to make us happy, but society never does because it's rigged in a way that exploits your own discontentment regardless of social change that occurs. I'm firstly going to explain in this speech why our case is more impactful in both breadth and depth than opening government. Firstly, it is more expansive in who it includes. Every person is affected by two things. Firstly, the way in which corporations use game theory analysis to appeal to your fact that you can be discontent, to make you more discontent, to monetize that. And secondly, every single person fears death. There is no pill you can swallow apart from this policy which makes you accept death and makes you understand death, because you never can die without living and being revived in that case. Secondly, we give the mechanism for why you act for others. It's not because you feel like your actions have value. It's because you see the inequality as the only thing that matters. So even on the metric of inequality being something that is harmful and valued, the current thing that fogs your vision is you think that you can rise to the top of that inequality. So if you're in the middle class, obviously the answer is you feel like you can become the elite. So you tolerate societies that are stratified because you believe in narratives that are promoted by those elites to say you can once become elite. But finally, as we told you, everyone is affected by debt to some degree. Debt to some degree, and by these corporations to some degree. Maybe not to the same degree as depression, but depression can be medicated, it can be treated, it can be changed. There's mitigation that can clearly occur and could have been given by opening opposition. But even if we do have these kind of changes and structures that occur, you can never escape death, you can never escape the feeling of being made to feel insecure. So our scope and our depth is frankly far larger than opening government. So given we've established that and our impacts are far larger, let's deal with how corporates and opposition rebutted us to try to change our way. They made a few points. The best point they make is that people can't learn from their mistakes the things that make you satisfied in the past. The problem with the speaker is it assumes you can be perfectly satisfied when you change your behaviour in a certain way. What we tell you though is that in a world in which you prioritise contentment and you can never really feel content, you keep wanting more. That is the consumer society in which you live. You get a new car, but the person next to you has two cars. So you want a third, and a fourth, and a fifth. You don't feel content even if the material circumstances are better. Even if you get a better job interview and you get a better job, you still feel like you're not enough because societies are stratified based on Stu's mechanism of corporations exploiting the way in which you feel insecure. But secondly, weigh the consequences. Even if you change your behaviour and you can individually feel happy, compare that to all the different structural incentives to make you feel unhappy. If I were an adjudicator, I think I would weigh that more substantially than at harm. But even if that isn't true, I would say that the fear of death is overriding. That is to say, you always act because you don't know what's coming. When you're older, that is far, far more concentrated. When you're 60, when you're 70, or when you're 80. That is something we uniquely avoid under our side of the house when you take this pill from the beginning. The next push is you lose the highs and the lows. Firstly, untrue, the motion allows for vicissitudes. The point is you don't have the overall feeling of discontent in your life itself. But secondly, look at the likelihoods of that. The final push, which is intuitively plausible, is the plus-size model movement means you can have progressive change. But Stu obviously wins this point preemptively by explaining why structurally it is incentivized to not have those movements. Because for every plus-size movement, that reacts to people feeling unhappy about their bodies, which corporations are incentivized to do, because they frankly make far more money if they make you feel ugly and unhappy because you buy more clothes. So it'll always be treating the symptoms, it's not actually tackling the cause of that particular policy. So let's now deal finally with closing opposition before I engage with the opening opposition clash and their feeble material on principles. But firstly, I'll deal with opening opposition, yes.
Sure, so we agree that materialism is a problem, but isn't a big source of social change then the idea that my neighbor might have more than me because of, for example, the color of his skin, and therefore that is unfair and something I should rail against?
Sure, but firstly, as we told you, you always believe you can achieve that. That is the kind of major conditioning factor of this policy. But secondly, we don't remove the idea that inequality is wrong. What Stuart brings you is that the only thing you see in a world where you're content is I'm content, but that person is being screwed over and I'm not. So you actually have far more of a concentration on that, whereas individually it's every man for himself rather than focusing on that inequality. So, closing opposition extension. Their first push is that there's political apathy because you don't want to influence other people. Firstly, you are obviously connected to your family, to your friends, to your dependents. You care deeply about them because of connections that aren't due just to yourself. So you want to vote for a future for your son or daughter, for example. So a lot of political motives still exist because you're content with your life, but you still want to make others feel better because the point is you still see their suffering and harms. Even if they're still content, you don't have the epistemological access to their brain. You still see them as suffering even if they're overall content when you see that unhappiness. But the second thing, and as we explained to you, that really defeats their entire case, is that there's no incentive to manipulate the state in the way they're trying to explain. Because why, as an elite, would I use corporate capture if I don't actually get contentment from exploiting and rigging the system in a certain way? So they say you're vulnerable to all the harms of the state, but never explain the motives for people to manipulate the state to harm you. Because obviously your only incentive then is to benefit everyone else equally, because you don't have to feel content and you're not filling that hole in you. I'll take you, then I'll respond to opening opposition. Yes?
Notably, the fear of death is larger when you are content because you fear losing that happiness. It's also probably easier to contend with death if you have more happy memories you can reflect on your deathbed, rather than just saying, fuck, my life was okay, I did not experience it to the extent
The
I wanted
first part
to.
concedes the mechanism of why you exploit other people because you want to feel happy before you die and you seek fame and adulation. So the second part of that is obviously wrong because, as I explained to you, and Stuart explained to you quite convincingly, you never understand or comprehend death, and happy memories erode because you forget them, but you always experience the suffering of not knowing what comes next. Finally, final thing to say is individual agitators like Nelson Mandela. People don't respond to them in the same way because their incentives are to, agitate. That's why it took so long to achieve those kind of revolutions, because people actually didn't have an incentive to do so. Finally, on opening opposition, two pushes they make. Firstly, it's immoral. There's three reasons why that's wrong. Firstly, analogy to drugs. They concede that it's actually based on extent. Secondly, determinism. Everyone is influenced by their own brains and influenced by their circumstances, so no one actually has control over any of their actions. So theoretically, this doesn't actually constrain your behavior at all, because we're all programmed and born into a world in which we have no control of our actions anyway. That was irrelevant. Secondly, on third parties, our material directly engages with this. We deal with more injustice because people are motivated by other things, and final pushes drive for improvement. Firstly, you're never satisfied or never have enough. Secondly, it isn't evenly distributed because you're acting in order to benefit yourself rather than other people. That is the final crux of their push. We get all the change they wanted, but we proved why it was irrelevant in comparison to the individual benefits everyone gets by not suffering the indeterminacy of death, by not suffering the fact you may be suffering body image issues or all the issues society perpetuates because they have incentive to do so. It does not exist under our side. We are proud to govern this.
I'd like to thank the government whip for his speech, and now call upon the opposition whip to close out the debate as a whole.
Aha, to je diferencijacija ovo prvo, ili?
Ovo je.
Dear panel, on the government bench, people are satisfied, but they would be more satisfied if they were to actually influence the government and change the laws to suit them better. That opportunity cost that we give you on closing the opposition, in terms of how people would actually have more happiness in total, is what wins us the debate, because it engages with marginal stuff that opening government and closing government talk about, where specific groups of people have more happiness. We tell you that overall, on our side of the house, the happiness is on its maximum. That's why this is the strongest point. Now I'm going to briefly compare us to opening opposition. This is what we show you. We show you that on everyday input, people do not exercise the opportunities they have to change their lives and to change how they feel. We mechanize opening opposition's third-party harm. We say that there's no learning without mistakes and without that important psychological learning mechanism or learning from your mistakes, and that there's no political change which also influences third party. I recognize that opening opposition talks a lot about why this is important, but without our mechanism, these impacts cannot stand in this debate. Now, I'll talk a lot about closing the government in this debate, because I think they're the strongest thing that we have to still face. So first of the idea of the fear of death. We're not sure why this is not comparative in this debate. Why, if you are content with your life, why you would still not fear dying because you are happy with your life to some extent, you're content. So they cannot just they cannot show up in WIP and actually introduce a part of their new extension, if I was speaking about that, just by phrasing it in a POI later on. But even if you don't fear death on their side of the house, that's a huge harm for them. Because the deterrent, for example, for suicide bombing that OG cares about in this debate is much less on their side of the house. For example, the safety and the security we talk about, if you don't fear death, is much less on their side of the house. The creation beyond your life is much less if you don't care about, if you don't fear for dying. The preparations you make for your death, for example, leaving money to your children and stuff like that, are much less on their side of the house. It's easier at the end to handle that because at the last moment you have more happiness that you are able to recollect on our side of the house than on their side of the house. But let's talk about corporations and why this is largely uncomparative. First, a couple of points of mitigation. Note that people still have needs, which means corporations still do exist and they still do something. Secondly, profit still happens because people have job obligations, which means if you're a manager of a corporation, it's still your job to bring profit, otherwise you are going to get fired, they're going to find someone else. So their mechanism of, but corporations don't have the incentive to gather profit and exploit people is not that comparative in this debate. But even if it is, and they have some sway here, obviously, you have to weigh that against what we bring you in this debate. You have to weigh against the less oversight we get because you don't get AOC or Bernie who's going to fight these bad corporations. You have to weigh that against people being, for example, content with the corporate tax rate being less than their income tax rate because they don't care about these issues, because they don't go to voting polls, because they won't simply be affected by these issues. You have to care about tax breaks that corporations are given in the status quo on our side of the house when you're not content in order to challenge their idea that corporation is bad. The machine, or the corporate machine, is still there on their side of the house. And the difference is that the people who are working in that corporate machine are content with the machine being the way it is. If it's exploiting them, for example, if they work for a very, very low salary because they're content with this idea. And secondly, they're content with being, there are people who are actually content on our side of the house with not fighting this. I'll take closing.
Elites prioritise their contentment at the expense of the poor, so governments weaponise existential fears by catastrophizing terrorism and immigration, which convinces people to vote against their own civil liberties and the democratic enfranchisement of others.
Okay, but on your side of the house, I don't see how that would be comparative, because the mechanism which you use this, for example, the mass media and stuff like that, the sensationalism still happens on your side of the house, so I don't see a huge change in that. Let's talk about open government a little bit on their major impact, and that's depression and societal thought. So it's very important that you have the info on the choice that people are making. It's very important, they would just blankscape all of the depression and, for example, suicide issues with the one thing, and that's, for example, taking the pill. Comparatively, there's some sort of depression, such as the postnatal depression, for example, or the stillbirth depression, that can be, if you take the right treatment, if you see the right doctors and stuff like that, you're likely to recover with help. The comparative is that this is irreversible on their side of the house. For example, they lose someone who would be very, very happy with having a second baby after they had a stillbirth at the beginning because they are not able to feel the same amount of happiness as they are because they took the pill. This is something that we bring more than the opening opposition says, because opening opposition says, but counseling is worse because people don't have the motivation. We say the very fact idea that people will not seek help, for example, might just be stuck in their rooms without actually talking to people, is what's not mitigatory, as they say, but it's something that actually removes the possibility that we actually help these people. With regard to neurochemistry concerns and stuff like that, there's therapy that affects serotonin creation, the new stuff. You can take little bits of MDMA and it helps you and stuff like that. So we don't think that this is really in this debate, but I'll take you guys, yeah.
So being content with your life holistically still means you can regret immoral actions, want to expunge discrete insecurities manipulated by corporations, and vote to change laws. This round is about recognizing your human dignity, not complete apathy.
No, of course you can, but it's the extent to which you do so is what is important. We had a whole extension talking about this, where Tim talks about that actually Nelson Mandela had to endure and wanted to endure so much oppression because he was not content with the status quo. The outrage, the dissatisfaction is what drives this very risky behavior because the trade-off is big. So on your side of the house, sure, still people might be unhappy about some of the things, but they're not willing to risk a lot because they're content with the way they are in the status quo. At the point where they are willing to risk a lot, that's when rewards for millions of people who still live in like oppression and poverty happen. So when you ask a POI about, oh, but are we going to torture the oppressed to make them better protesters? No, but know that in the status quo, people and thousands of people are literally tortured all across the world, and on your side of the house, people are content with that happening. On our side of the house, people are not content with that happening. That's when you get the change mechanism that we get you in this debate. Specifically, for example, with stuff where we talk about how you, on their side of the house, you rationalize your mistakes. There's no need to change. On our side of the house, you have a learning mechanism that allows you to actually change. But also, in the idea of voting, we say how you get the complete control of the state on our side of the house because you are not content with the way things look like, because you are interested in going to the voting polls, because you're interested in like taking part in politics, like making the change and stuff like that. So people in North Korea are largely satisfied because of the propaganda, but we would very much like want them not to be satisfied with the very same propaganda. We would want them not to be content with the situation they are in, because we know that objectively there's something better out there for them, and we know that if these same people do not reach out for that better position by themselves, there's no one and nothing that can actually drive them from the very bad position they are currently in. That's why we are proud to oppose.